Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on the Saga project. You will be muted throughout the presentation, but you can ask questions through the Q&A. So if you have any questions, please type them in. And at the end of the presentation, I will try to answer any questions that you may have. So let me share my screen here. Today's presentation is called Something Said, which is the English translation for the word saga. And what I'm going to talk about today are new tools to connect people, places, and you to the sagas of the Icelanders. In addition to these slides, I will do a demonstration about how you can use the Icelandic Roots database, if you're a member, to explore these connections between the sagas, the places where your ancestors come from, and people associated with those sagas. Let me start, because I know this is a public webinar, and just explain a little bit about Icelandic Roots. Icelandic Roots is a nonprofit organization. It has an educational mission. Its purpose is to strengthen ties between Icelanders and those persons of Icelandic descent in North America. What we try to do is broaden access to historical documents and records. And our ultimate goal is to inspire meaning in our everyday life through a mutual understanding of culture and heritage. So it would be best if I started with how we got to do this Saga project and what it means and sort of the purpose of it. And that goes back to immigration to North America from Iceland. Now, immigration started in 1855 when many Icelanders went to Utah. Then there was a second bout of immigrants who went to Brazil in 1863. After that, a large number came to North America, both the US and Canada. About 14,000 left. It's hard to know how many people left and stayed. Many came back. Thousands were unrecorded. Some people listed in the record are duplicates, but the best estimates are that 1 in 4 left from 12 different ports in Iceland. That's a quarter of the population. So this was a huge cultural shift for people on the island, and also in North America, to take on a new culture and leave their old one. And this picture here just shows the many different places that people went around the US and Canada. And what's interesting is that there's often connections between these communities. They weren't very isolated, in fact. So what was happening that caused this immigration between 1870 and 1914, when most people left Iceland? Well, the communal farm structure was unraveling. And those people who lived in the south moved to Reykjavik. And that was because the fishing industry was taking off, and commercial fishing in big boats was becoming a new thing that people could pursue instead of living on these farms. Those who lived in the north and east of the country moved to North America. And as of today, about 2/3 of people live in Reykjavik. 1/4 of the population left. So in one sense, all Icelanders left Iceland. The whole culture changed by the mid-20th century. I'm going to just talk a little bit about my own family in order to relate it to the Saga project, and to show you how you can also apply what you know about your family from the Icelandic Roots database to explore its connection to the sagas. So my family comes from 2 areas of Iceland. One of my great grandmothers comes from Stóru Akrar, which is in Skagafjörður, and she was one of the original group who went to Kinmount and eventually to Gimli. When she left, she lived about, Stóru Akrar is about, it's directly south of Hafsós, and about 6 miles away was a famous poet named Balu Halmar, and he wrote a poem for her and her husband when they left that lamented the young Icelanders who were leaving the country to go west and talk. The poem was somewhat prescient because it talked about the potential dangers of leaving, and she encountered many of those. And interestingly, although the poem was very sentimental, it was a very unusual poem for Balu Halmar to write, because he was mostly known for his invectives and his criticisms of the bureaucracy and the church. But anyway, she went to Kinmount, and at Kinmount, she brought 3 children. Her youngest was an infant boy, and he died at Kinmount. They went to Gimli, and then there was the smallpox epidemic. She lost her husband at Gimli and was a widow. At that point, the Canadian government didn't allow women to homestead, so her mother, who was with her, had some cousins in Minnesota, and they decided to move to Minnesota, and they homesteaded there. She met a man from Eastern Iceland, where most people from Minnesota come from, and married him. And in our own family lore, and I've noticed this amongst a lot of Icelanders, is that there's some saga character that they have identified as being related to through books. This is prior to the databases. In our family, it was Eagle Skallagrimson. I've heard other people say, Rollo the Viking, or some other saga character. And usually that's because they know they're related to some priest, and there are these tremendous amount of books on genealogy that then relate. You can trace back one person. So I don't want modern Icelandic Roots members or other Western Icelanders to feel that they know everything is, all the information is limited compared to what people knew then. In fact, in some ways we know more, because now we have the database and we can actually explore we don't have to trace through books. We can explore many different relationships, and that's what I'd like to talk about today. Well, farm life back then in the 19th century involved a lot of hard work and long winters. And during those long winters, there was something called evening wake, which was when you spent time knitting, talking about folklore, reciting poems, hymns. And this is where children learned about the sagas. So what are the sagas? Well, I'm going to talk mostly about the sagas of the Icelanders, because there's many different types of sagas. The literal translation is something said. So that means that there was an oral tradition that described these stories long before they were written down. They depict events that happened between 1874 and 1030 AD. And they were finally put to vellum or paper, it's vellum, in the 13th century. This was during Norwegian colonization. So Icelanders saw the culture was changing, that they were going to come under the Norwegian crown, and I think there was an impetus to really write everything down and get their culture written for the next generation. This was the end of self-rule for them, and there was this general push to record the Icelandic culture. So what are these sagas? What are their features? Well, they're 40 novel-length texts, and there's a tremendous obsession with genealogy, just like we have here at Icelandic Roots. At the beginning of each saga, it documents the ancestors of each character in great detail, often going on for pages and pages. And it's often helpful to get a pencil and paper and write down the relationships so that you can refer to them later when you're reading the stories. The book covers several generations of the first settlers. It discusses the feuds and disputes that they had, and reconciliations that different families and people had together. Unlike other types of literature, there's a strong sense of fatalism. So events will happen, and the saga characters will try to stop them, but there's no stopping these events, no matter how hard they try. And over generations, these cycles of violence and feuds continue, and despite the best efforts of the characters in the story. In addition, it's notable that these stories cover a lot of issues that relate to modern life and relate to many of the things we talk about today. So some of the sagas discuss issues around gender roles, the making of a good marriage, and psychological struggles that people may have. One question we often get is, are the sagas historical? Well, there is a factual basis to the events, but the sagas are not purely historical. They often relate historical events to a story that's delivered in the tradition of a Germanic heroic narrative. The characters are very compelling. They often combine within themselves a sense of naturalism, that they're very real people who make stupid mistakes and are much like us, but also epic grandeur. And this is what I think makes them very compelling. The later sagas have Christian overtones, and those are often indirect, but are interesting to identify. And all sagas usually have satisfying endings where things come to a peaceful or happy end. Back in the 19th century, when our grandparents and great-grandparents were leaving the country, the sagas were very important. They helped mold the national identity, and they were related to the independence movement, which emphasized the past independence of Icelanders. The sagas were depicted as the golden age of Iceland, when there was self-rule, and they were contrasted against the anemic life under colonial rule. So I want to talk a bit about why we are doing the Saga Project and what was lost with immigration to North America. And I'll begin by talking about a member of our database, Gudrun Finnsdottir, who emigrated to Winnipeg in 1903 when she was 20 years old. She was married to a printer and poet named Gisli Jonsson, and she was a writer, and she wrote from the view of an immigrant who was still rooted in Iceland. She wrote many short stories when she first got to Winnipeg, and then she took some time off from writing to raise children and went back to writing after they were grown. And she has a short story called Utangards. And in this story is about immigration and what was gained and what was lost. And I think it's very important to mention this to understand why we're doing this project. So in this story, let me go back one slide. There's a character named Una who's asked if she liked or disliked living in America. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I've highlighted some key points here. Disliked it, Una repeated. I wouldn't say that, but so much of me stayed behind, which I always wish I could have assembled into one piece instead of dividing. And then she notes in this highlighted portion, here we cannot teach our children their ancestors' history in place names or show them any physical traces except in words. So that's what was lost, was this sense of a physical environment. And at the bottom, she says, what was gained, I've often felt proud of being able to manage on my own, of owning my own home, and of knowing that my children and I will never be treated as paupers. So this was something that most immigrants face. They longed for being able to show their children and their grandchildren the places and the history that goes back 1,000 years, but were unable to. But they felt a gain in the sense that they were no longer poor and they lived in an environment where they would be treated fairly. So that sort of describes why we decided to do the Saga Project. And the Saga Project is an attempt to relate those physical places to the people and the farms and the ancestral farms and in the database. And we would not be able to do this without the help of certain people at the University of Iceland who developed the Icelandic Saga Map. So what is the Saga Map? Well, it culls an immense saga literature and it plots each place name mentioned on a modern map. The map is interactive. It won the Applied Science Prize Award in 2015 in Iceland, and it's the brainchild of Professor Emily Lethbridge, who was quite helpful in sharing with us this information. And it includes, and I also want to recognize members of her team who worked very hard to put this together, and I've listed them here. So thank you, Emily and team. And if you want to visit the Icelandic Saga Map, you can visit it at sagamap.hi.is/is/. So what were we doing with the Saga Map? Well, the Saga Map collects texts, locations, and dates. And Icelandic Roots is known for collecting genealogy data on our ancestors going all the way back to the saga characters and places. And so what we wanted to do was integrate this data into Icelandic Roots to develop an enhanced Icelandic Roots database that connects history to genealogy. Here's a map developed by Doug Hansen at Icelandic Roots, which takes many of the saga, well, all of the saga places in Iceland that the Saga Map produced and plots them on a map that is consistent with the Icelandic Roots places map for Síslas. You can see that there are literally hundreds and hundreds of saga events that take place throughout Iceland. And these are represented on the map. And you may even know what area your family came from by looking at this map, and you can see where the dots are and what saga events might happen. So before I do the demonstration, let me show you some basic things. If you're not an Icelandic Roots member, I encourage you to become one so that you can explore your own history and the history of your family. And that you can do that by visiting IcelandicRoots.com. If you are a member, then you can simply log in and go to this place called Special Collections. And Special Collections is where we have the saga information. I've highlighted here in red where you go after that. So once you click on Special Collections, you go to Sagas. You can list the sagas in alphabetical order. You can list the sagas chronologically. You can close Saga Places, and you can look at people reference. Okay, so let me pause this for a minute and do a demonstration for you. All right. Okay, so now I'm in the Icelandic Roots database. I'm already logged in. I'm going to go to Special Collections, and there we can list the sagas alphabetically. Oops, I'm not logged in. We can list the sagas alphabetically. Here, I have the sagas listed, and each one is named in Icelandic, and in small writing, it's in English. It's difficult to see. You can click on the saga icon to see the manuscript itself in its original vellum. And you can click a link here to see a synopsis of the saga. Some of these sagas are translated in English, others are only in Icelandic. You can read them in English here by clicking here, and Icelandic here. At some point, we're going to add people who are referenced in the sagas. We don't have that yet, although you can easily search for those people using the existing Icelandic Roots people search function. And then there's a map of places referenced here. So this is there's a lot of information. There's 37 of these. We're working with University of Iceland to get the remaining 3, which they have yet to share, but they will. And you can review the different sagas here. We have many of the famous sagas like Njalt Saga and Eagle Saga, Herbyggja Saga, Finnboga Saga, Gisli Saga, Grettir Saga, etc., etc. You can also list the sagas chronologically. So if you wanted to read these sagas in the order in which the events occurred, you can do that. So Grettir Saga is known to begin in Norway and then talk about the move to Iceland. Laxdæla Saga talks about move from Ireland to Iceland. So they even begin prior to the settlement. And you can go along about that way, understanding and learning about the sagas. The last 2 things I want to talk about are the, well, first let me go here. This is yet to be populated, people referenced in the saga, but we'll have a section here where you can look for a person's first name, their last name, the saga that they're in, the chapter that they're mentioned in, and their person ID so that you can search their page. We have virtually all the saga characters already in the Icelandic Roots database. So you can, once you know a saga character, you can already search for them under people search, under search options, if you were to go to people search right here. All right. So let me talk to you a bit about Saga Places. I mentioned that my family comes from Stóru Akrar and from the Hoff Farm in Vopnafjörður. So let's start there. I would go to this Saga Places search window. I click on, let me go back here. I click on this magnifying glass, and then I'm going to go search for what saga events happen in Vopnafjörður area on the Hoff Farm. And I find it right here. I click there. Now I can set the map to show me places that are within 10 kilometers, which is about 6 miles, 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers, or 50 kilometers from the farm. And I'm just going to do 10 kilometers because I want, let's say I'm visiting Iceland and I'm visiting an ancestral farm and I want to know what saga events to read about. So I'm going to click display, and it's going to show me a lot of different saga places. If you've been reading any of my recent blog posts or Facebook posts, I've been posting a lot about Saga of Thorstein the White, Vopnafjörður Saga, and people of Vopnafjörður, and those are represented here. So these all cluster around the Hoff Farm, which you can kind of see right there, the letter H for Hoff. And these are all within 10 kilometers. And actually, Thorstein Saga Vita, the Saga of Thorstein the White, takes place on the Hoff Farm. So does Vopnafjörður Saga. And but in addition to those, there are a few other sagas which I was not aware about that have events that take place. Njalt Saga has an event that takes place here, and there's another saga. I can't find it now, but it's on this list that takes place. Oh, Fljótsdæla Saga takes place also. There's an event that takes place near the farm. And so if you go to these places here, obviously Vopnafjörður Saga has many chapters that it takes place on the farm. So many chapters reference places on the farm, and those places are listed here. But also Njalt Saga, if you go to chapter 134, you'd be able to find where they reference what happened in that famous saga on that farm. So this allows you to zoom in, and you can visit these places. You can read the sagas. You can bring them with you. You can read from home. You can try to understand the ancient history and how it relates to where you come from. Okay, so let me go back to close Saga Places. Now I'm gonna look here at Storu Akrar, which means big fields, and I found it here. I'm going to just display events that happened 10 kilometers away. So here it is. It's directly south of Hafsos. And there's not as many events that happened here. But there are a few major sagas that are well known. Finnboga Saga and Eagle Saga had events that took place here. So just for the purposes of this exercise, I looked up what happened in Eagle Saga here. And basically in Eagle Saga, that saga is about Eagle Skallagrimsson, who's considered Iceland's greatest poet. He did not live in this area of Iceland. He lived to the west. But roughly 2/3 away through the saga, both his sons die unexpectedly, and he locks himself into a room, and he's tricked into taking food. His plan was to starve himself to death, and he writes down one of the greatest poems in Western literature, which is in an English translation is "The Loss of Sons." It's notable for being the first poem to take the subjective point of view. Most sagas, if you read them, you'll notice that they do not take a subjective point of view. Everything is described in behavioral terms, what people do, where they go, etc., but not from an internal monologue. And that poem describes how he's coping and how he decides to cope with the death of his sons. After that, he sort of adjusts and recovers a bit from the loss of his sons, and he returns to normal life. When he returns to normal life, a friend of his, Einar Helgason, gives him a shield, a very beautiful shield that he had obtained in Norway when he was there. And the shield is made of gold, and it's ornate, and he registered some disappointment with receiving the shield because tradition requires that he compose a drapa, which is a poem about the gift. And so he does that. Anyway, to get to the point, he takes the shield to a wedding here in North Iceland, right exactly here on this farm, where the number 2 is written here. And he's had this shield for quite a while at this time. And somehow the shield gets damaged. I don't know if it gets wet or something happens, and it's no longer usable. So they decide to kind of burn it and take it apart. They do that here, and they discover that it has gold bars inside of it. So that's the story behind that. This just gives you a sense about how you can connect to your past, how you can connect to the farms of your recent ancestors or other places in Iceland that you like to visit or that you're interested in, and relate them to your history and the history that your grandparents, great-grandparents, etc., knew very well, and that maybe you know less well because you're no longer in those physical spaces. So that is pretty much my presentation. If there are any questions in the question and answer, please put them in. I'd be glad to answer them. Okay, I don't have any questions. Well, thank you very much for letting me present to you about the Saga project. Oh, I do have a question. Are there plans to have all the sagas translated into English? We don't have those plans. You know, I would say probably 30% or 40% are translated to English. Certainly the best sagas, the ones that are considered the highest form of literature, are translated into English. And so that's a positive, but not all are translated in English. And it's not necessarily easy to translate them into English because they are literature and it's not a simple task. But hopefully more and more will be translated. Okay. I'm looking here at the Q&A. I've got a couple of questions. Would I like help listing character names? Yes, I would. Anyone who wants to help with the Saga project, who is an Icelandic Roots member and wants to volunteer, please get in contact with me. My email is jason@icelandicroots.com. Thank you. This is such a great asset. Enjoyed your presentation. Thank you. Someone has noted that Vidar Heinzen has edited volumes of translated sagas. That's good to know. I've got a question. Do I speak and read Icelandic? No, I'm terrible with it, but I'm trying to learn. Any other questions? Okay, well, that's great. Thank you very much. Appreciate you taking the time on a Sunday to listen to my presentation. And glad to present this to you, and I hope you get some use out of it. Thank you so much. Bye.